Each of us is an individual with different ideas, hopes, and desires. Yet we all belong to larger groups, families, towns, provinces, nations. Somehow we have to all get along together and find a way of making decisions that affect us all. The Peace Tower in Ottawa is probably the most familiar symbol of Canadian government. Our parliamentary democracy is meant to represent us all. But how does our system of government actually work? How did it come to be the way it is today? Does it really represent us? Let's start with the most basic question. Why do we bother having a government at all? Any group of people, whether it's as small as a family or as large as a nation, needs a framework of order so it can function. Governments provide a political structure for a society, and most of them do that by making rules called laws. All governments and all political parties follow some idea about how the world should be. These ideas are called ideologies, and a few of them have had great impact in the last 2 centuries. Conservatism, socialism, liberalism, communism, and fascism all started in Europe, but they've spread across the world. Ideologies can agree on some things and violently disagree on others. For example, they can differ in how many people are in charge, ranging from one person, a dictatorship, to many people, a democracy. An ideology can be left-wing, which broadly means that it is in favor of change and looks to the future, or right-wing, which usually means that it supports traditional values and takes inspiration from the way things were done in the past. If you're a capitalist, it means that you favor individual ownership of property, while a Marxist would say the government should control it. Another way of looking at an ideology is according to how much control it says the government should have over people. If it recommends that government have total power over every aspect of life, then it's totalitarian. While if it says that people should be free to do whatever they want, it's called libertarian. These are just 4 aspects of ideologies. Now we'll look at the particular ideologies we mentioned a while ago. Conservatism looks to traditional values and existing social patterns. It is cautious about rapid change and tends to regard moral questions as public ones. It can be characterized as generally democratic, capitalist, right-leaning, and somewhere in the middle on personal freedoms. Socialism anticipates an optimistic future. It can be democratic or dictatorial, or anywhere in between. Favors strong government involvement in the economy. It opposes unrestrained capitalism, is left-wing, and can cover the whole social range from repressive to free. Liberalism upholds the values of intellectual freedom, and like socialism, it places hope in the future. It frowns on government interference. Generally, liberalism is democratic, capitalist, moderate, and libertarian. Communism, as originally proposed by Karl Marx, argued that only the total abolition of private property can eliminate social injustice. Everyone would take part in decision-making, so in theory, communism is democratic, anti-capitalist, left-wing, and favors government involvement in all aspects of life. And finally, fascism. This ideology reached its peak with Hitler and Mussolini. It holds that the nation comes first, and all activity should be directed to the national good. Business is tolerated but kept under firm control. Fascist states are often dictatorial, usually but not always in favor of government action in the economy. Fascists are right-wing and fiercely intolerant of any opposition. Fascist governments often look to a mythical past for their inspiration. The ones we've mentioned are only the 5 most prominent ideologies today. All these ideologies have many shades and often merge into one another. None of them has ever been put into practice exactly as the theories demand. They are all ideas for an ideal human society. Canadian political parties all fit into the ideological patterns we've mentioned. If we draw a political spectrum from communism to fascism, then the main parties of Canada fit into the central area. Extremist parties don't have a large following here. The First Nations and Inuit peoples have lived in this land for many thousands of years. Their societies are diverse, and each culture has its complex political structure suited to their environments. When the French and British arrived, they brought with them their systems of government. After years of intermittent fighting, the British conquered New France in 1760, and it became a part of British North America. Vast stretches of the west and north remained sparsely populated by Europeans and effectively beyond the reach of the colonial administration. But in the populated east, there was a gradual move towards responsible government, with less direct rule by Britain. Support was growing for some form of union, to give the people living here more control over their own affairs, and for security against their powerful neighbor, the United States. Finally, after years of debate and negotiation, in 1867, Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick confederated to form a new nation called the Dominion of Canada. Under the British North America Act, each province kept its own government, but now there was a new federal government to look after national concerns. It wasn't an easy task. Almost immediately, Nova Scotia tried to leave the new nation, and in the west, an armed rebellion at the Red River settlement led to the creation of Manitoba in 1871. The same year, British Columbia joined the Confederation, lured by the promise of a transcontinental railway. It took 78 years, the Northwest Rebellion, 2 world wars, and a depression before Canada gained its present boundaries, when Newfoundland joined in 1949. Confederation in 1867 defined the shape of the whole political process in Canada. But our society today is drastically different to what it was then. It's worth thinking about whether the system those 19th century politicians made has been flexible enough to handle that change. The blueprint for the Canadian political system is our Constitution. At its core is the British North America Act, signed at Confederation back in 1867. In 1982, the Trudeau government and the British Parliament patriated our Constitution, bringing it completely under Canadian control. The Queen is still the head of state, but there's no other legal dependence on Britain. At that time, the BNA Act was joined with several new sections, including the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, to become the Canada Act, our formal constitution. So, Canada is a federal, democratic, parliamentary constitutional monarchy. That means we're a federation of provinces. We elect our own government, which meets as a parliament. We operate according to a written document, and the head of state is a king or queen. Canada has 3 levels of government: federal, provincial, and local. The federal government looks after those things that affect the whole of the nation. Things like defense, social welfare, and foreign relations. It also looks after overseas trade, the CBC, customs and immigration, currency, the RCMP, and Canada Post. The federal government gets money from taxes, which it has to decide how to divide up. Some of this money goes to the provinces, and some it keeps for itself for its own needs. Provincial governments take care of matters affecting only their province. They look after things like hospitals, ambulances, water and power supplies, building major roads, provincial trains, and the school you attend. Provinces get money from the federal government as well as from taxes they collect themselves. Some provinces have their own police forces, and so do some of the larger cities. The third layer of government is local government. Every town or area in Canada has its own local government, usually in the form of a council. It looks after local roads, garbage collection, parks, libraries, playgrounds, public buildings, and so forth. The people who run it are elected too. The person in charge is called a mayor or reeve. The council is made up of a number of aldermen or councillors. All levels of government have the main job of making and administering laws and rules, but they can only affect their area of responsibility. A provincial law made in Manitoba, for example, has no effect in Newfoundland. This is how the structure of the federal government looks. At the top is the Queen or King, represented here by the Governor-General. Then the system divides into three main parts. The legislature makes new laws and consists of the House of Commons and the Senate. The executive puts the laws into action. It's headed by the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, which is usually drawn from the government party's MPs in the House of Commons. Cabinet ministers are responsible for various ministries. The executive also includes most government departments. And the judiciary is the Supreme and Federal Courts. Their job is to interpret and apply the laws. Provincial governments are structured much the same way as the federal government. The same three branches, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, all exist in the provincial government, though none of the provinces have a Senate. Otherwise, the passage of laws happens in much the same way. To see how it actually works, we'll follow the course of a new law. A proposed law is called a bill. The idea for a new law can come from many places, from public lobby groups, from government departments, from political parties, and from individual members of Parliament. According to the Constitution, any member of the Commons has the right to stand up in Parliament and propose a new law, but often it's the Prime Minister or a minister. The Prime Minister is the leader of the governing party. The Cabinet is a group of MPs the Prime Minister has chosen to look after particular areas, like health, defence, finance, or external affairs. These people are called ministers. There's nothing in the Constitution about either the Prime Minister or the Cabinet. In fact, there's nothing to say that they even have to be members of Parliament. These things are an example of convention, unwritten traditions that almost everyone agrees to abide by. So let's imagine that a cabinet minister wants to introduce a new law. After their department had drafted the proposal, they'd stand up in the Commons and briefly describe the bill. This is called the first reading. The bill is then printed up so that all the MPs can read it and think about it, and then a bit later it's presented to the Commons again. This is called the second reading. The minister gives a speech on why the bill is a good idea, and it's debated by the House of Commons. If a majority of MPs vote in favour of the bill, it goes to the next stage, which is a committee made up of a number of MPs from the major parties. They suggest improvements and iron out difficulties. After that, the bill comes back to the Commons for the third reading. This is usually a routine vote. The bill then goes to the other chamber of the Parliament, the Senate. The Senate goes through a similar process to the Commons, 3 readings and a committee. Initially, the Senate was meant to provide representation equally for the provinces and also to give a second thought to legislation. After the bill passes through the Senate, it goes to the Governor-General. When the Governor-General signs the bill, it officially becomes a law. This is called royal assent. The civil service then has to implement the law, setting up all the mechanisms which will make it work. If there's a dispute about how the law is meant to work, or if someone thinks the law runs against the Constitution, they can go to the courts, that is, to the judiciary. The courts also judge in criminal cases. There are a number of different levels of courts, both provincial and federal. In theory, the courts are independent and judges are free to make the judgments they consider best, regardless of the wishes of the government of the day. We'll turn now to consider the people who sit in the House of Commons, the members of Parliament. How do they get there? What do they do? In Canada, provincial and federal elections generally both work in much the same way. When a government calls an election, Parliament is dissolved and the electoral process begins. All the eligible voters are registered or enumerated, and political parties select the people they want to run in particular seats. These people are called candidates. The candidates then spend the period up to Election Day campaigning, trying to convince the voters that they are the best representative and that their party has the best policy.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
On Election Day, voters cast their ballot to decide who they want to represent their area. That night, the votes are counted and the winners gain a seat in Parliament. The party winning the most seats becomes the new government, and their leader becomes the Prime Minister, or Premier if it's a provincial election like this one. Election nights can be tense and exciting events. If a government wins more seats than everyone else put together, it's called a majority government. If it gets less than half the seats, it's called a minority government, and often has to seek support from another party to get laws voted through Parliament. As you can imagine, minority governments tend to be less stable and to have shorter periods in office. The party with the second highest number of seats becomes the official opposition. In Canada, the opposition and the law courts act as checks and balances to the government. At the first session of Parliament after an election, the new members are sworn in and take their place. There's a lot for them to learn and a lot to do. They have to sit in Parliament, attend committee meetings, deal with a mountain of paperwork, and constantly travel backwards and forwards between their ridings and Parliament. They also have to assist everyone in their riding, while at the same time trying to advance their party's policies. Here's what a few MPs have to say about what they do.
Really, there's 2 or 3 aspects of the job. One is to make sure that the views of the people that elect you are reflected in and are heard in the House of Commons. People who are trying to arrange their pension or who are having trouble with unemployment insurance often will call their Member of Parliament because they're not as familiar with how the system works. The best thing is that you have the chance to help people sometimes who really need to be helped, who deserve to be helped. And you can, and you win your case sometimes.
I'm the critic for Aboriginal peoples. That's the area I'm from. I felt there were a number of areas where my people needed things to change, and that's where I felt, this is where I felt I could do the most good. Which there may be some conflicts, but that's part of being a politician, is being a tricky dancer. Avoiding the pitfalls and being able to judge how far to go on one issue and when to go forward and when to retreat. And sometimes when you take a stand on principle, when you really believe in something, then you have to go all the way. But if you are going to stand for nothing, you're going to be nothing.
And I don't think I've ever had a dull, well, not quite a dull moment, but a dull day since 1979. It's been wonderful, fascinating. Someone comes to see you and they have a real problem, almost always, and what can you do to help them? So you write a letter to the minister, you make a speech, or you introduce a bill or something, and it doesn't always work, of course, but you've got to try. You are accountable to your 78 or 80,000 voters, and they're going to judge you 4 years hence, and you've got to basically make sure you do a good job from day in, a week in, a year, a month out, if you like, and if you do, you'll probably be re-elected. If you won't, you'll be thrown out on your ear.
In any system so complicated and involving so many people, problems are bound to arise. Trying to solve some of these problems so that Parliament works better and represents us better is called parliamentary reform. There are a number of main criticisms about the way our Parliament has come to operate. For example, some argue that the executive, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, has too much power. While in theory any member of the Commons can propose a new law, in practice it's usually the Prime Minister or a Cabinet member who introduce bills. The Prime Minister also appoints senators and Supreme Court judges, as well as prominent members of the public service. Critics argue this puts a lot of power in the Prime Minister's hands. Another criticism is the practice of party solidarity. In theory, an MP is meant to represent the wishes of their electorate and vote that way in Parliament. In practice, all a party's MPs get together to discuss the matter and decide how to vote. Then, everyone in the party is expected to vote exactly the same way. If an MP decides to vote against the decision of the rest of their party, it's called crossing the floor. Such members are usually immediately expelled from the party. They still have a seat in Parliament, but now they're on their own. It's a serious step, as David Kilgore explains. He voted against his party on a taxation issue.
I had, I think it was 7,500 letters or phone calls or petitions or visits from constituents, about 7,500 saying they were opposed to it for a whole lot of reasons, and I think I had less than 10 saying they were for it. Anyway, finally, the thing came down to the vote. I voted against it, and along with Dr. Kindy from Calgary, and we were both expelled that night from the National Caucus, and the next day from the National Caucus, and never been done before. They tell me that in Britain, for example, tax bills have not been confidence measures since 1836, I think it is. And yet here we are in Canada at the end of the 20th century expelling two members because they felt in conscience and with their constituents that they couldn't do it.
There are also some strong criticisms of the way the Senate works. Most of them center on the fact that senators aren't elected, but instead are appointed by the Prime Minister. There's often friction between the different levels of government, particularly between the federal and the provincial levels. This is commonly because of disputes over which government should be in charge of a particular project, or who's responsible for a problem. There are a lot of other tensions at work in Canadian politics too, of course. For example, between the English and French communities, or between the eastern and western parts of the country. Remember, though, that this is just what governments are for, to find peaceful solutions to the conflicting demands of different parts of our society. So that's a brief view of how our government works and how it got to be that way. Government affects us all in just about everything we do. There are many ways ordinary citizens can attempt to change the way a government acts. Sometimes people will protest about decisions that have been made and try to change them. That's what these truck drivers are doing in front of Parliament in Ottawa. But there are lots of other ways you can affect government. You could write a letter to the papers or to your MP or to any member of Parliament. You could collect signatures for a petition, join a street march, form a pressure group, or organize public meetings. But the main way we can change government is through our vote. We can all vote once we're old enough, and it's important to know how to vote for the things we want. If you want to, you can join a party or run for office. You could even end up being Prime Minister one day. Democratic government exists to serve its citizens, not the other way around. It's up to us all to make our government work for us.